Had a Shasta College fall semester film studies. Hope you're enjoying your life. Hope you're enjoying these movies we're watching together because movies are life. There is no separation. Today is Wednesday. Next week is the whole week is off because of the holiday, Thanksgiving. And so I'm going to assign an essay today. Don't worry about it. You'll have plenty of time to do it. It won't be due till the Monday we get back, which is the 30th. But I'll sign it today, so you have plenty of time to watch the movie. You're going to watch Midnight Cowboy and write a critical essay, and then others, my other class, will watch 5 Easy Pieces and write a critical essay. Both movies changed everything there was, and they're part of that documentary. Like when we saw the quiz, they were part of that also, mentioned briefly, I think. Keep having patience on me grading everything because I'm trying to catch up. Hopefully this week I'll do that when there's no class. Okay. So that's it. So after that, we're only going to have essentially 2.5 weeks left of school when we get back. And so during that time, you're going to need to do a research paper. I will put out maybe 10 subjects you can write about. So you'll do the research, and we'll talk about this more later. But the research paper is different than the essays. You'll do research, maybe watch some documentaries, whatever you need to do, 3 to 5 pages, worth 10 points. It'll be the last paper you'll have to do besides your journal and reflection, which will be due the last week of school. Hopefully you're keeping up on that. That's worth 10 points. Only thing that was worth a little bit more now was the quiz, which was 15 points. I made a mistake on the math and said it was worth 20, but that was too much. So I knocked it down to 15 because there was only essentially 3 sections. Each section's 5 points. That's how we did it. So a student pointed that out to me, and they were right. So that'll be it for the class. But we're not done yet. So keep up the hard work, keep viewing movies, and keep thinking critically. Today I'm going to talk about genres. Now, a genre is another fancy French word for category. So we've watched all sorts of genres since we started this class. How would you define a genre? Well, there's genres and there's subgenres. But right off bat, I would say the main genres we're dealing with are romantic comedy would be a genre. Science fiction, absolutely. Horror, absolutely. The two I'm going to talk about today are westerns and musicals. Do you like westerns? Is that a generational thing because we're so far from the Old West? When I grew up, we all wanted to be cowboys. Now everybody wants to go into outer space. I'd rather avoid outer space personally. There's nothing out there that I'm interested in. Sorry, folks, Star Wars isn't out there. It's more quiet, desolate, and lonely, and a vacuum, and you cannot breathe. Yeah, that's where I want to go. I'm having enough time dealing with what's here on Earth right now, let alone going out there where I can't breathe. But be that as it may, the Western genre, I'm going to make you guys watch a documentary. Martin Scorsese does a film. He put it together quite a few years ago. It's a film documentary starter. He kind of covers different aspects of movies throughout history. And I'm going to probably assign his Western to you so you could go look at it. It's only 20 or 30 minutes. And so I don't believe he does a musical, but he covers a lot of genre, and that's one of them. Why is the Western important? Well, when movies first started, and you know when they started, late the last tail end of the 19th century, folks, we weren't that far from the Old West. And some aspects of the country were still the Old West. People were still riding horses, even though the car was around. And so it it was the near past. It wasn't the way past like it is now. And so lots of movies were made in that genre because you could tell a story and have people on horseback in costumes, whether it's a story about the Civil War, like Birth of a Nation. Um, I wouldn't call that a Western because it's not set in the West, folks. It has to be set in the West, west of the Mississippi, but it is a period piece, and they rode horses, and they essentially had a lot of the same stuff a Western would have, except for it was set in the Civil War in the South, a little different. Um, the Westerns usually are set in the West, folks, and they're usually about pioneers, um, individuals who were taming the nation. They're cattle barons. They're they created the country we're living in now. They built it on their blood, sweat, and tears. And was there a lot of um, bad things in the way that have happened? Absolutely. Our treatment of Native American is atrocious. Most of these Westerns treat Native Americans badly. They're always the enemy and they kill a lot of them. We've changed that way. But even John Ford, the great John Ford, who directed many, many Westerns from Stagecoach to The Searchers to Cheyenne Autumn and the Calvary trilogy and on it goes. The Three Godfathers. He considers himself a Western director, even though he directed a lot of movies that weren't Westerns. But a Western could be something. You could have a modern Western with the same themes. You just don't have to have people on horseback. Although it helps. There's modern westerns going on right now. Not very many of them, but there's some TV stuff like Yellowstone, and there was another one called Longmire about the sheriff out in. It's supposed to be in Wyoming, but it's all filmed out in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And even though they're driving pickup trucks, but they're wearing cowboy hats and they got 6-shooters, so they've got some of the iconic props from westerns. I guess you could say that. Another great western that John Ford did was My Darling Clementine, about Wyatt Earp and his brothers at the OK Corral with Henry Fonda. Brilliant film, not historically accurate, but that's how you can rewrite history, folks. You don't have to do it accurately. Maybe you've seen some newer westerns like Tombstone, which is not that new now. Came out in I think 92 or something. Probably one of the last great westerns, in my opinion, ever made. With Val Kilmer playing Doc Holliday and the stoic, always reliable Kurt Russell playing the more boring part of Wyatt Earp, because Kurt Russell does that well. Anyway, so there's been some good ones in the past 30 years. Let's say The Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood's movie, which got very good notices, Academy Awards, etc. Set in the Old West. Every time they say the Western's dead, another one pops up, and it kind of shuts everybody up. I mean, just recently, Quentin Tarantino did essentially 2 period pieces. One was set in the Old West, called The Hateful Eight, and you saw it. Very brutal, almost operatic type of movie. Lots of brutality, lots of dialogue, which is what he's famous for. And Samuel Jackson, his usual, a lot of his favorite people he puts in, and his treatment of women, and it is usually bad because Tarantino a lot of times treats his women not so good in his movies. Besides Kill Bill, although think about it, He tortured the hell out of Uma Thurman in that movie. Um, so there's always someone coming up with a new Western that puts makes people relook at the genre as not a dead something that's dead or in the past. Um, Even though we're a long way from the old West with our electric cars and cell phones, um, but have our attitudes really changed? I don't know. Maybe not. Um, so people are still Westerns are still, in my opinion, not just my opinion, but the box office will tell you that you can still succeed at making a Western. Why was it such a popular genre? Not as popular as it used to be. There, at one time on television, there was something like 30 Western television shows, from Bonanza to Gunsmoke to The Rifleman to Have Gun Will Travel. you know, I can't list them all. Wanted Dead or Alive, The Rebel, a ton of them. Big Valley. um, anyway, lots of Westerns. And then they fell out of favor in the 70s. The reason why they fell out of favor, because of a lot of the cultural shift that we saw in that documentary. That you had the civil rights were raging, and we're looking at the old Western as kind of a dead horse. Bad pun, I know. Um, and so people didn't want to see it anymore. They wanted to see something new and contemporary. So then we have movies like I'm assigning right now, Midnight Cowboy and Five Easy Pieces, and 2001: A Space Odyssey, Clockwork Orange. We're moving away from the Western big time. Then we got into Jaws, and then we moved into the new Western frontier, outer space with Star Wars. Um, we'd always had sci-fi. Went back clear to the silent films. One of the first movies I signed you guys to look at was Rocket to the Moon, Trip to the Moon, rather, 1905. That's pretty old, and it's sci-fi. Sci-fi is another genre, another huge popular genre that has been abused and corrupted. Now I would call it fantasy fi. What do you call superheroes? Certainly not sci-fi. There's no science in a guy in a cape flying around, but there's a lot of fantasy in it, magic realism, that's for sure. So the Western was about man's individual, the rugged individual against the status quo, against nature, taming nature. That's always a big thing. Um, Breaking in the new territory, finding a new way to live, more free, maybe without all the rules and regulations until they showed up. And in every Western movie, that so often happens, where the rough shotted individual gunfighters and cowboys and are getting pushed aside by the homesteaders and people wanting to build churches and schools. They were always against that, because that's civilization. And in the old West, the rugged individual didn't want anything to do with that. But they couldn't fight it. There was a great series recently on HBO called Deadwood. Wonderful, wonderful series. A lot of it based in fact about Deadwood, a real place, by the way. The last great big kind of gold rush town. And at first, it was populated by. Hope you got to see it because it's really wonderful. Homesteaded by the rough individuals who've been pushed out of the more civilized towns, who didn't like all the rules and regulations and were willing to take the chance of striking it rich in a renegade town that didn't really have a lot of rules and regulations, except for in the through the business end of a six gun, as they say. Um, the gold rush was a land grab, illegal land grab, that on Indian territory, um, that was not legal until later on. It was shut down, and troops had to come out there and shut the whole thing down. And then they got churches and schools, and then the guys from there had to move somewhere else if they're lucky to move anywhere. But that was pretty much late in the 19th century. So the West was definitely dying even then. One of the great Western directors, Sam Peckinpah, who I talked about last week, his Western, The Wild Bunch, is considered um, kind of the death of the Western. He kind of put the spike in the heart of the Western with that movie. Where could you go from then? He deconstructed our normal expectations of the West and men in the West. He made really bad killers into the good guys. He turned the Western genre upside down. You didn't know who was good. You didn't know who was bad. Everybody was bad, but there was people that were worse. And of course, he upped the ante with his ultra-violent um, ballet of blood, they used to call it. He didn't like that, but he created it. So you watch a movie like The Wild Bunch, and you think, well, that's it. It's exhausted. This genre is exhausted, and it was for many years. But every once in a while, a Western pops up that changes our minds again. Who knows where the next one will show up at? We don't know. The other genre I wanted to briefly talk about was musicals. Now, that was such a popular genre. Remember, we talked about films in the 30s during the Depression when people were looking for an escape. Well, they escaped through musicals, Hollywood musicals, and they put out some great ones. MGM mostly, Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly were predominantly male dancers who danced their way through fantasy, fairy tale like material with different partners, and people couldn't get enough of it. It was great fantasy, those kind of musicals. Then later on, the musical changed when things got a little rougher around the edges in the world out there, and people just weren't willing to accept fantasy-based material. And so there was later on in the 50s when things changed, when we're out of World War II now, we've gone through a war. We've got the Cold War to deal with. We got the House on Un-American Activities brewing, and then we get different musicals that define the era. I mean, one would be a Gene Kelly movie called Singing in the Rain. Now we're looking at the musicals in a little more rougher environment. It's just not purely fantasy. It's got some heartache and reality to it, and it's just not there to entertain us. It's there to kind of hopefully teach us something about who we are. And we get into the 60s, and the musical was still alive, to a certain extent. Obviously, if you know The Sound of Music, you know what I'm talking about. But think what the background is to The Sound of Music. Nazis. So we're not talking about happy times here. We're talking about terrifying times. But there were some great musicals during that time. Or one of them is West Side Story, one of the best musicals ever written about gang warfare in New York City in the 50s between Puerto Ricans and locally Anglo, I guess you would call it, group. And it's based on Romeo and Juliet. And one of the Puerto Rican girls, played by a very non-Puerto Rican actress, Natalie Wood, who couldn't sing either, her voice was dubbed, falls in love with Richard Bremer, who was part of the other gang, and they shouldn't meet because one's Puerto Rican, one isn't. They should not cross-pollinate, but they fall in love with each other. And if you know anything about Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, tragedy will befall everyone. Great musical music by Leonard Bernstein and the lyrics by Stephen Sondheim. Gower Champion did the groundbreaking choreography, and it's exciting. It's truly exciting, and it's filmed. A lot of it's filmed in actual locations in New York, and so there's a tougher background to the musicals. It doesn't look so fantasy anymore. This is reality, as much as we can in a musical where people break into song in the middle of eating their dinner. I know that doesn't jibe with reality, but reality, who cares? Movies aren't reality, and musicals aren't either. Sometimes they heighten reality. If anybody has seen the musical now, Hamilton, maybe you've seen it. Were the founding fathers, were there African Americans? Were they Puerto Ricans? No, I'm sorry, they weren't, folks, but they earned that. Were they rapping and singing to hip hop music and dancing to hip hop? Sorry, folks, they weren't, but they doing that, and it makes it more alive and relevant than ever before. So you could take a historical thing like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers creating this country, and you could put it to hip hop music with a multiracial cast, and it still packs a wallop. It's turning the genre upside down, and sometimes that's what you need to do to make people, to bring it back to life. So that's a great example of a new musical that's didn't ever get to play in the movie theaters, but you could. I think it played on some pay-per-view channels. And it won all the Tony. It was, it was a regular Broadway musical, won all the Tony Awards, as did West Side Story, as did a lot of these musicals. So many of them started as a Broadway play, and they transferred it to the big screen. But then musicals got out of hand, and like you saw in that documentary that we had the quiz about, big grandiose musicals like Hello Dolly, made in 1969, literally had no relevance for anybody besides the old guard in Hollywood who thought had timing. They wanted to see Easy Rider. They didn't want to see Barbra Streisand singing about trying to find a man, a matchmaker. They couldn't relate to it. There's not much there to relate to. Even you could tap your feet to the music, absolutely. Later on, I mean, Martin Scorsese tried his hand in a musical. It's a really good film. I don't think it's a great film, but it's really good. New York, New York, which he did with Robert De Niro. Hard to believe, De Niro in a musical, yeah. But folks, he plays a jazz musician. He does not sing, thank you, nor dance. But Liza Minnelli does. It's got a great soundtrack. New York, New York. Maybe you've heard of that sound, that song. Anyway, got to get really great soundtrack. So people want to try their hands at the musicals, especially filmmakers that came out of film school, because of the 50s and 60s and 70s. The filmmakers that were mostly represented in the documentary Easy Rider, Raging Bulls, a lot of them wanted to make a musical because that's what they grew up with. And some of them then did, for good and bad. So the genre is, you don't see too many musicals right now that are coming out in the movie theaters. Of course, nothing's coming out in the movie theater right now. But musicals are still important. They tell us who we are, why we are, where we are in time and space. And they do it with a catchy soundtrack. And somebody like Stephen Sondheim has written some of the greatest musicals in the history of any literature. Shakespeare's literature, Shakespeare's plays, Edward Albee plays, Arthur Miller plays, Tennessee Williams. Mozart, nobody's up there as high as Steven Soderbergh. And Sondheim, his musicals are always dark um, and foreboding. They can be, like Sweeney Todd or Assassins. Yes, Assassins. Company, so many more follies. Brilliant, brilliant man. He just turned 90 this year. He probably will not be making any more musicals, but he's still alive and well. And they made a couple of his. Sweeney Todd was made into a musical with Johnny Depp. It's okay. I think Johnny Depp was not the right character for that. I actually seen that movie with the original Broadway cast, and it was brilliant and genius, really. The film was just okay. Tim Burton, it's just a weird combination. It's okay. They cut out 90% of the story too, but it made it to the big screen, the musical. So Tim Burton, who's essentially, Tim Burton from the Edward Scissorhands to Edward popular movies. Um, he wanted to do a musical. Who knows? But at least he did it. In the last couple of years, none of the musical was popular with Chicago, Richard Gere and whatnot. Being and it could turn gothic like Sweeney Todd, or you saw Les Mis political. So we have these goals that could